A 14-year-old girl pedals her bicycle through a quiet street, her dress plain, her hair neatly braided, a careful smile resting on her face. The German officer walking beside her believes this is nothing more than a harmless flirtation, a brief escape from war. He does not know the road ahead bends toward the woods. He does not know this is not a date. How did a child become one of the most lethal tools of the Dutch resistance? She would later say she never thought of herself as brave. At 14, bravery was not a word that existed in her vocabulary. Hunger did. Fear did. Silence did. The war arrived in her childhood quietly, then stayed long enough to take everything familiar with it. Freddie Oversteegen did not begin with a gun. She began with errands, delivering notes, carrying messages folded into bicycle frames, smuggling leaflets beneath coats too thin for Dutch winters. She learned early that being young and female made her invisible, and invisibility in an occupied country was power. German soldiers rarely searched girls who smiled back at them. They rarely suspected children who looked harmless. Then the missions changed. She and her sister were asked to do something no child should ever be asked to do. They were told to be friendly, to listen, to flirt, to agree to a walk, sometimes to accept a drink, sometimes to promise more. The men they spoke to wore uniforms. They laughed. They trusted easily. They believed they were in control. The woods were never far. Freddie did not pull the trigger the first time without shaking. She remembered the sound afterward more than the act itself. Not the gunshot, but the silence that followed. The way birds scattered. The way the forest returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. That was when something inside her closed. Childhood did not end in a single moment. It ended in fragments, each mission taking another piece with it. After the war, people would speak of heroes and victories. Freddie spoke of sleep that never came easily, of memories that arrived uninvited, of a war that ended on paper but continued inside her head for decades. She had survived, yes, but survival carried a cost history would take a long time to notice. Freddie Oversteegen was born in 1925 in Haarlem, a quiet Dutch city where life once moved at the speed of bicycles and church bells. Her early years were marked not by comfort, but by scarcity. Her family lived with little money, little security, and few illusions about the world beyond their doorstep. Long before German troops crossed into the Netherlands, Freddie learned what she would later recognize as quiet resistance. Sharing what little there was, distrusting authority that demanded obedience without justice, and understanding that survival often depended on helping others remain unseen. Her mother played a decisive role in shaping that worldview. A woman with strong left-wing convictions, she believed neutrality in the face of oppression was a form of complicity. When Jewish families and resistance couriers needed shelter, the Oversteegen home became a place of temporary refuge. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations, just whispered instructions, meals stretched thin, and children taught when to stay silent. Freddie and her sister Truus absorbed these lessons without being formally taught. They learned to listen. They learned to watch. They learned that fear could be managed if it was understood. When the Germans occupied the Netherlands in May 1940, the shift was immediate and suffocating. Soldiers filled the streets. Posters appeared overnight. Curfews turned evenings into empty corridors of darkness. Food became scarce. Trust became dangerous. For adults, the occupation demanded moral choices. For children like Freddie, it erased the boundary between childhood and responsibility. There was no longer a protected space where innocence could safely exist. School continued, but under the shadow of occupation. Teachers avoided certain topics. Friends disappeared without explanation. Rumors traveled faster than facts. Freddie was still young enough to be underestimated, yet old enough to understand that the world around her was being reordered by force. She noticed how soldiers treated women differently, how young girls were ignored rather than interrogated. At the time, it seemed like a small detail. In hindsight, it would become the foundation of her role in the resistance. The Dutch resistance did not arrive at her door as a dramatic summons. It emerged gradually, through acquaintances, through tasks that seemed almost harmless. First came errands, then messages, then the realization that her age and gender made her uniquely useful. By the time Freddie understood the full implications, refusal was no longer a simple option. In occupied Harlem, to say no was to risk more than oneself. It was to risk everyone connected to you. What set Freddie apart was not ideology, but adaptation. She did not romanticize rebellion. She accepted it as a condition of survival. The war did not turn her into something extraordinary. It forced her to grow up faster than any child should have to. And by the time the resistance began asking for more than silence and speed, the path ahead had already narrowed. War had not yet asked her to kill, but it had already prepared everything to make it inevitable. By 1941, the Dutch resistance was no longer a loose collection of brave gestures. It was becoming a necessity. Arrests increased. Deportations became routine. Executions were whispered about, then confirmed. Harlem, like much of the Netherlands, lived under a system designed to exhaust people into obedience. The occupation did not rely on constant violence. It relied on fear becoming ordinary. Resistance groups operated in fragments. Cells rarely knew one another. Trust was rationed. Messages were coded or delivered by hand. Radios were hidden beneath floorboards. Weapons were scarce. Every action carried consequences not only for the individual, but for families, neighbors, entire streets. In this environment, invisibility mattered more than strength. That was where Freddie and her sister Truus entered the equation. They were young, they were female, they were poor, and to the occupying forces, they were harmless. German soldiers did not see threats in teenage girls riding bicycles. They saw distractions. They saw background noise. The resistance saw something else entirely: access. At first, the requests were measured. Carry this package. Deliver this note. Memorize this address and forget it afterward. The sisters proved reliable. They asked few questions. They did not panic when stopped at checkpoints. They learned quickly how to lie without sounding rehearsed, how to smile without revealing fear. Each successful task expanded the boundaries of what was asked of them. The moral tension grew quietly. No one sat Freddie down and explained the full scope of what resistance would demand. There was no moment of formal consent. The war advanced in increments, and so did her involvement. One task led to another. Each refusal would have required a level of safety that no longer existed. Saying no was not a neutral act. It was a risk calculation with other people's lives included. Eventually, the assignments changed in nature. The resistance needed certain men removed. Collaborators, officers known for brutality, individuals whose absence would save lives. Traditional methods were dangerous. Sabotage invited retaliation. Armed attacks drew attention. What they needed was something quieter, something that did not look like resistance at all. They needed someone who could get close. Freddie was told what was expected, but not pressured with ideology. There were no speeches about patriotism, only facts. If these men continued their work, others would die. If they disappeared, entire networks might survive. The logic was cold. The burden was immense. And it was placed on shoulders that were still growing. What made this moment unbearable was not fear of death. It was the collapse of moral distance. Killing was no longer an abstract concept tied to soldiers and battlefields. It became personal, face-to-face, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to see doubt flicker in another human being's eyes. Freddie did not step back, not because she felt fearless, but because there was nowhere left to retreat to. Childhood had already been compromised. Safety had already vanished. What remained was a choice between acting and allowing harm to continue unchecked. The resistance did not ask whether this would damage her. War rarely asks such questions. It only measures effectiveness. And in that cruel arithmetic, Freddie Oversteegen became indispensable. The work changed Freddie long before it hardened her. At first, there were rules. No weapons unless necessary. No unnecessary risks. The resistance believed escalation could be controlled, that violence could remain selective. Freddie and Truus moved through Harlem and its surrounding villages as if they belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Bicycles became extensions of their bodies. Streets became routes memorized not for beauty, but for exits. Cafes were no longer places of rest, but testing grounds where every glance mattered. Their assignments relied on one fragile assumption, that occupying soldiers would underestimate them. Freddie learned how to listen more than she spoke. She let men talk about boredom, about power, about what they would do after the war. She smiled at stories she would never forget. She remembered details she was not supposed to remember. Names, habits, routes home, which men drank too much, which ones carried their weapons carelessly, which ones liked the idea of being admired by someone young enough to look impressed. When the moment came, it was never rushed. An invitation to walk, a suggestion of quiet, a path that led away from witnesses. The resistance did not always tell Freddie exactly how the mission would end, only that it had to. Sometimes she carried a gun, sometimes she did not. Sometimes another operative waited out of sight. The forest absorbed what the streets could not. With each mission, the psychological cost increased. Freddie noticed it not in guilt, but in numbness. The body adapted faster than the mind. Her hands stopped shaking. Her voice remained steady. What unsettled her most was not fear, but how quickly fear stopped arriving. That absence frightened her more than danger ever had. The escalation was not only external, it was internal. Freddie began to understand that violence was not a single decision, but a sequence of adjustments. Each successful operation made the next one easier to justify. Lives saved became numbers. Faces blurred together. The resistance praised effectiveness, not emotion. Survival demanded compartmentalization, and she learned it too well. Yet she never became careless. Every mission carried the possibility of exposure. German counterintelligence tightened its grip. Informants appeared in unexpected places. A wrong word, a familiar face seen twice. A single moment of hesitation could end not just her life, but dozens of others. Freddie learned to disappear in plain sight, to alter routes, to abandon routines, to become forgettable on command. What separated her from myth was restraint. She did not see herself as an executioner. She did not seek revenge. She acted because in occupied territory, delay was deadly. The resistance did not frame her work as heroism. It framed it as necessity. That framing allowed her to continue, but it also ensured that the emotional reckoning would be postponed rather than avoided. By the later years of the occupation, Freddie was no longer learning how to resist. She was enduring it. The child who once carried leaflets beneath her coat now carried memories she could not set down. Each operation layered silence upon silence. The war demanded efficiency, and she delivered it. But with every escalation, the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming grew harder to measure. Victory, if it came, would not restore what had been lost. And Freddie, though still young, already sensed that survival would not mean escape. By the final years of the occupation, the margin for error had vanished. German patrols intensified. Arrests became preemptive rather than reactive. Resistance networks were being dismantled not by force, but by patience. Someone talked. Someone always did. Harlem no longer felt merely occupied. It felt watched. Every familiar street carried the possibility of recognition. Every delay invited suspicion. One mission would later stand apart in Freddie's memory, not because it was more violent than the others, but because it stripped away the last illusion that survival could remain separate from consequence. The target was known, not a faceless uniform, but a man whose actions had already led to arrests. Waiting longer meant more names added to lists that ended in camps or firing squads. The decision was made quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. There was no room left for hesitation. Freddie followed the routine she had learned to perfect. Calm voice, casual tone, nothing rushed. The meeting unfolded exactly as planned, which was what made it terrifying. There is a unique dread in realizing that everything is going right when the outcome is irreversible. They walked. The city noise faded behind them. The woods accepted their footsteps without comment. In moments like this, time does not speed up, it slows. Every sound becomes isolated. Breath, leaves shifting. The distant echo of a train that would never stop for what was about to happen. Freddie understood, with a clarity that cut deeper than fear, that this was no longer about orders or resistance strategy. This was about choice. A final, conscious crossing. When it ended, there was no triumph, no sense of accomplishment, only the immediate awareness of exposure, the need to leave, the discipline to move before emotion could take hold. Survival instincts reasserted themselves with ruthless efficiency. She did not cry. That came later, much later, when there was time, when there was no longer anything to do. But remember, the danger did not end with the mission. It expanded. Suspicion followed. Faces appeared where they should not have been. Freddie felt it in her body before she could articulate it in her thoughts. The war had tightened around her. She was no longer merely participating in it. She was marked by it. This was the moment when the cost became undeniable. Even if the resistance succeeded, even if liberation came, even if she lived, the war had already embedded itself inside her. There would be no clean ending, no clear division between before and after. Only a life divided by what she had been forced to do when there was no other option left. History would later speak of courage, of sacrifice, of necessary violence. Freddie understood something quieter and far more permanent. Some victories do not feel like victories at all. Liberation did not arrive as relief. It arrived as silence. When the war ended in the Netherlands in 1945, flags returned to the streets. Crowds gathered. Names were spoken aloud again. For many, victory meant a return to something recognizable. For Freddie Oversteegen, it meant the sudden absence of purpose, structure, and urgency that had defined her adolescence. The danger vanished almost overnight. What remained had nowhere to go. She was still young, barely an adult by age. Yet she carried experiences that had no language in peacetime. The resistance disbanded quietly. Weapons were hidden or destroyed. Files disappeared. The work that had demanded everything from her was sealed behind silence, not celebration. There were no parades for teenage girls who had lured men into forests and left alone. Freddie tried to live an ordinary life. She married. She raised children. She learned how to occupy space that was no longer contested. But the war did not respect the boundary between past and present. Sleep became unreliable. Memories arrived without warning. Loud noises, sudden movements, unfamiliar faces could pull her back into moments she had never processed. There was no term for post-traumatic stress in her world then. Only the expectation that survival meant gratitude, not confusion. What made the aftermath heavier was the absence of recognition. Others were named. Others were remembered. Male fighters, armed units, public heroes. Freddie and those like her were footnotes, if they appeared at all. Their work had been designed to be invisible. History honored that invisibility too well. For decades, she rarely spoke about what she had done, not out of shame, but out of exhaustion. Explaining required reopening doors she had spent years holding shut. The war had taken her youth, then demanded her silence in return. Society was eager to move forward. There was little appetite for stories that complicated victory with moral ambiguity. Freddie survived the occupation, but survival, she learned, was not the same as release. The war had ended. Its echo had not. Freddie Oversteegen was not remembered quickly. History, when it did speak of the Dutch resistance, preferred cleaner narratives. Sabotage, armed men, clear victories. The story of a teenage girl who used her youth as camouflage, who killed not out of hatred but necessity, did not fit easily into commemorative speeches. Recognition came late, painfully late, decades after the war had ended, after much of her life had already been shaped by silence. Freddie was finally acknowledged for what she had done. Medals were offered, interviews requested. Her name began to appear alongside others who had long been celebrated. She accepted none of it with pride. Freddie never described herself as a hero. She resisted that word. Heroes, she believed, chose freely. She had chosen under pressure, inside a narrowing corridor where every option carried consequences. What history framed as courage, she experienced as obligation. What others called sacrifice, she understood as survival under conditions no child should ever face. When she did speak, she spoke carefully, not about triumph, but about cost, about how war reshapes morality until killing becomes procedural and silence becomes survival, about how a child can be forced to perform adult violence long before developing adult defenses. Her legacy was not one of glory, but of warning. And that is the question Freddie Oversteegen leaves behind. If a 14-year-old girl can be transformed into a weapon by circumstance, what does that say about the world that required it? If her actions saved lives but destroyed parts of her own, how should history remember her? As a hero? Or as evidence of a failure so vast that children were left to correct it? Freddie did what was asked when no one else could. She lived with the consequences when everyone else moved on. And that is why her story matters. Because remembering her is not about celebrating violence. It is about refusing to forget the price paid by those who were never meant to carry it.